So I just wanted to say welcome, everyone. I'm Judy Stevens. I'm the program manager, adult senior program manager for Hanover Parks and Rec. And we are pleased to be able to offer you, we co-sponsor with Osher, the Brown Bag Lunch and Learn. And Bob Hargraves has graciously accepted to instruct this program for us. So feel free, there's water over there and there's coffee. So feel free to help yourself and enjoy his program.
Thank you very much. I've seen a couple of advertisements for this talk, and some of them said 2 hours and some said an hour and a half, so I'm prepared to do either. What I plan to do is to start off the talk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes about alternative energies, and then we'll have a discussion period. Then we'll talk about what I like to do, and that is nuclear power, and what we're doing and how that works, and that will probably use up, when we're all done with the discussion, an hour and a half. But I also have another little talk about fear and why it is that people fear radiation and nuclear power. And those of you who want to stay around we'll be happy to do that. We can continue that as well. Let me first see if I can get my technology going here and start on alternative energies. Hey, it works. Okay, can you see? Do we need to change any screens or anything? Any shades or anything? Okay, all right. Alternative energies. We have a big problem to solve, and that is, well, let's see. The problem is, why doesn't my iPhone work? Just for a second here. Make sure Keynote is open and that your devices are on the same Wi-Fi network. Okay. Just for a moment, they were before, but you never know. They're on, that one's on. Okay, well, we'll just do it a different way. Okay.
There you go.
All right, there we go. First slide here. CO2 emissions into the atmosphere are still going up. The total is the line on the top. This is data that just came out last month from the BP Statistical Review for 2018. The gray line here is the developing nations. The other two parallel lines at the bottom are the EU and the US CO2 emissions. So they're more or less flat. The developing world is going up. The total is going up. If you want to see numbers instead of charts, we have these numbers. Energy consumption growth in the world went up 2.9% last year. CO2 emissions 2%, and you can read all those numbers. Renewables did grow rapidly, 14.5%, but they're such a small part of the energy source that we use that they only represent a quarter of the growth. So most of the growth comes from fossil fuels. Okay? We're not coming close to reducing CO2 emissions. If anything, we're increasing the rate of them. Why do renewables get so much attention? Well, they get a couple of reasons. One is it sounds good. It's free. It's, you know, but the biggest creators of more wind and solar have been the feed-in tariffs. That is, these are rules that require utility companies to buy wind or solar at a certain fixed price, no matter what. Whenever it's available, you have to buy it and provide it to the users. The other thing that's happened more recently in the last 5 years or so is renewable portfolio standards. And that is, a lot of legislatures in various states like Massachusetts and New Jersey have set percentages of power that the utilities must provide from various sources, solar, wind, hydro. Those are prescribed. It's not a market-based system. It's an absolute system. So Massachusetts says, I don't know the number, you must get 20%. That's just a fictitious number. But they don't have that much capability. So there's a whole market set up called Renewable Portfolio Standards, where people that generate a kilowatt hour of electricity also get one paperwork renewable portfolio standard that they can sell to places like Massachusetts utilities companies, which buy them to gain compliance with the law. There is a market, an open market for that service, and people bid into it and buy the renewable portfolio standards. Now, the wind developers and so on sell their electricity to the utility company at prices that sometimes seem amazingly low, 3, 4, 5 cents. And I want to point out that from the point of view of the developer, he couldn't make money doing that. Here are the other sources of income that a guy like Bittersdorf over in Vermont gets to choose from. Now, all these various sources we'll go through just for a quick minute here, but they are complicated. They change a lot. They're different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The jurisdiction might be the US or the New England region or a state or a town. Okay, all these rules are very complicated. So for example, if you have reserve capacity, for example, you're a natural gas generator just spinning along, okay, you can get money for having a reserve, that reserve to provide power when it's needed or if something else fails. Federal income tax credits, about 30% of the capital cost of wind and solar projects is paid for by the federal government with tax credits that unusually are paid up front. We also have state income tax credits. Vermont had 30% as well. That's been phased out now in Vermont. We have accelerated depreciation. Property taxes, many jurisdictions exempt those kinds of facilities from having to pay property taxes. There are some direct grants from time to time. We have the concept of green bonds insured by an entity and at a lower than market interest rate, so that cuts the cost down. Again, production tax credits, you get about 2 cents for every kilowatt hour that you generate from the federal government as a tax credit, but you get a choice as to having either the tax credit or the federal income tax credit, and people usually like the money up front, so that's gone by the boards. Renewable energy credits we talked about, but those are 10 to 20 or 30 cents a kilowatt hour, depending upon the market and the type of energy that's being provided. Also, curtailment. If you're in a nuclear power plant and across the river somebody says, I want to turn my windmill on, and I have the right to do it because I have a preference by law, you, the nuclear power plant, have to shut down a bit and let the windmill get the money. But the nuclear power plant doesn't easily scale up and down because the metal heats up and it cools. It expands and contracts. And the more you do that, the more you get creep damage to the metal, and it uses up the lifetime of the metals in the plant. So the power plants want to keep running. So they say, oh, we'll pay in order to be allowed to run. We know the law says the windmill guy gets the money, but we're going to do that. So the windmill guy gets curtailment money. Okay, that's what happens with zero or below zero or negative prices for electric power. Now, how much power is it? There's a lot of energy used in the world. And if I tell you how many petawatts or gigawatts or exawatts, you know, it kind of goes over your head because people aren't comfortable with those kind of numbers. So a friend of mine at Stanford Research Institute, Ripu Malhotra, and his friends wrote a book on this, on the theme of the energy unit people will understand is a cubic mile of oil. What is the energy you get for burning 1 cubic mile of oil per year? That's his favored unit, and we can kind of understand that. In fact, the world consumes the amount of energy every year equivalent to burning 4 cubic miles of oil. So now we say, okay, we want to get off fossil fuels instead of oil. Let's see what we can do with these various other sources. One source is solar roofs, okay, photovoltaic solar. Okay, if we do the math and figure out each one is 2.1 kilowatts and it generates electricity 20% of the day, then we need 4.2 billion roofs like that to get the equivalent energy of 1 cubic mile of oil. That means we have to do 250,000 every day for the next 50 years in order to generate that 1 cubic mile of oil's worth of energy, a quarter of the world energy consumption. Well, what about solar, concentrated solar power, like the one in California, Ivanpah, and so on? Again, those solar parks have a similar thing. They can only run maybe 20–25% of the time. These are in the Arizona and California and so on. Ivanpah, well, some of them have the advantage that since they're thermal, that is, they generate a lot of heat, that heat can be stored in molten salt vats so that they can spread out the consumption or generation of electricity over the day as they cool the salt. So there's an advantage of that, but it's a lot more expensive than PV solar, so it's not very popular. But you know, that project took weeks and weeks and cost $2 billion, and we'd have to do 3 a week for 50 years in order to power up 1 cubic mile of oil that way. I stole his slides, by the way. Hydro. Again, here's the biggest dam that I know of, the 7 Gorges Dam. I don't think it's a real good picture. I don't think it's that. But if it generates power about half the time, what with seasonal floods and rains and whatnot, we're talking about building the equivalent of the 7 Gorges Dam every quarter for 50 years. Okay? And you know, all the controversy and so on we had going on 10 years ago when we were flooding the 7 Gorges and ruining the landscape and relocating 1 million people. Okay, we want to do 1 a quarter for 50 years. Anyone been to Niagara Falls? Who's been to Niagara Falls? Hey, Ann and I went just 2 weeks ago. So I took this picture. I said, well, wait a minute. Somebody said to me, what about Niagara Falls? Well, I did the math here again. There's the generating station data. We'll skip over that. But basically, 700 Niagara Falls. That's a lot. There's not a lot of room. Niagara Falls drains the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater body in the world. And it's 20% of all the freshwater in the world. It all drains through Niagara Falls. Okay, so where are you going to get those others? We could do a Niagara Falls project every month for the next 50 years in order to get an energy source that would deliver the same energy as burning 1 cubic mile of oil. What about the windmills? Again, same idea here. This slide says 1.6 megawatt windmill. Sometimes they're bigger now. And 35% availability is pretty good. That would be the Great Plains. You could do maybe a little better than that in the ocean. But again, 1,200 a week for 50 years. And we know the problems about how difficult it is to get that done, how expensive it is. So are those possible? And if they were possible, what about the intermittency? I mean, the solar parks only generate energy when the sun is out, and the windmills only when the wind is blowing. How do you solve that intermittency problem? People say, well, we could build a long cable between the Sahara Desert and the Atacama Desert, and we put all our solar panels there, and either the sun will be shining one place or the other. Okay, that's very expensive. That's not going to work. Or maybe the wind, when it's not blowing in Vermont, will be blowing in New Hampshire. No, the weather systems are much bigger than that. They're on the size of a quarter or half the country. So you can't even things out that way. So what about storage? We could store the energy in batteries and then take the batteries and feed it out. Well, so I went to the Tesla website for batteries for their power walls and did the math and so on. And 1 cubic mile of batteries would only hold the same energy as 1% of a cubic mile or more. Can you imagine? If we wanted to do if we wanted to store the whole energy of a cubic mile of oil, it would take these silly numbers down here. You have to build one every millisecond. Okay? So batteries don't work. What about nuclear? Well, that's a lot of power plants. There are about 500 in the world today, maybe 50 or so under construction. We need to build 1 plant per week for 50 years, good-sized plants, in order to generate the same amount of energy as burning 1 cubic mile of oil. That's a lot of nuclear power plants, but it's doable. In fact, that's the goal of our company, to build that many power plants that fast. And that'll be the subject of the next talk. Anyone who asks a question gets a free pen.
I already got a pen.
Oh, you got one. You can ask the question.
Well, my friend has a solar company, just tweeted on Facebook. He figured it need 800 panels to zero out his home energy cost.
Yeah.
And then he realized maybe he overestimated a little bit, but his house isn't that big, of course.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Got a question for you. This is only the construction cost, the initial construction cost. It has nothing to do with their obsolescence of the technology or rusting of the solar panels or whatever.
Right. These numbers are just, approximations. They're big scale numbers.
They might be 1/10 or 1/20th of the total cost of keeping that nuclear energy or the wind turbines working for 50 years.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say 1/10, but yeah, I mean, there's a high capital cost in nuclear, in solar panels, and
I mean, the nuclear, you got to refuel every, 10 years or something like that?
Something like that.
By the time that you get the
Sure.
50 years, you
Right.
refuel the first ones.
Right. And that's the advantage of oil. There's not a big capital cost, right? You keep pumping it out. The cost is the fuel, right? Go ahead.
Go back to slide 2.
All right, we'll go to slide 2.
Yeah. So you had nice graphics up there, but what percentage of the world's power is consumed by the U.S. today?
Oh, who knows that number? I'd guess 10%. What would you guess?
What was the question?
What percentage of the world power is consumed in the U.S.?
Oh, small.
Not that small. 10 or 15%. It's just a little more than you.
Well, if we just look at the CO2 emissions, okay, and we eyeball it here, and the U.S. we've forgotten. U.S. is the blue one, okay, so we'll do an accurate measurement. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So about 1/6 of the CO2 emissions, so we guess 1/6 of the energy. Yeah. Okay, question?
Remind us again, Bob, about the world consumption of oil. It's 4 cubic miles per what?
Per year.
Per year.
That's not oil consumption, that's oil
Well,
equivalent.
total
Equivalent, right.
Total energy equivalent.
Right, but in fact, 70% of it, no, it's. I was 60 or 70% is going to be oil. Another 10, 20 is going to be coal.
Right.
Oh, and I forgot natural gas. Deduct that.
Total world consumption per year is the equivalent of 4 cubic miles of oil.
Yeah, equivalent of it. Okay. All right. Want to learn about nuclear?
Other comparisons, a comparison I used to use with my classes, what is the energy required to make 1 aluminum can in terms of oil, It's larger than the 12 ounces in the can.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's like 16 ounces of oil to make one aluminum can. Now, they are recyclable, but that's on a small scale, but it gives
Yep.
you some idea how we use it.
Yeah, in the aluminum industry, they sometimes they use a lot of electricity to refine aluminum. They sometimes call aluminum solid electricity because most of the value added is electric power. So it's good to recycle aluminum cans. That's a real good payable.
Not to make them.
All right, let me figure out how to do the next talk here. All right. We have two goals at Thorcon. One is advancing the prosperity of the developing world by providing them with inexpensive, ample, full-time energy. And the other is checking global warming. And just for openers, we're building power plants. This is what they look like. Here are two 500 megawatt power plants. That means they can generate 500 megawatts of electric power. A city like the interior of Boston might be powered by a couple of these. They're pretty good sized plants. They're about 65 meters across, 170 or so meters long. So these are big ships, in a sense. They're to be built in a shipyard, floated to the site, and then ballasted with sand or water down to the seabed in shallow water and basically operated permanently at a shoreside location. So that's the general idea, what we want to do. And let me show you the demand for electricity. First of all, here's a scatter plot. On the bottom is per capita GDP. Vertically, we have basically electric consumption per capita. And all the dots represent countries. The US is somewhere up in here. But we see there is a linear relationship. You need electric power in order to develop your economy, right? For lighting, for transportation, for refrigeration, for all those kinds of things. It's a strong correlation. 1 kilowatt hour, which is worth maybe a dime, will generate or enable $4 to $6 of GDP. Okay? And there's some references here about that relationship. So people want electricity. In the US, we have enough. We can afford to say, well, turn this one on, turn that one off. If you go to places like Indonesia or Thailand or like that, they're desperate for power. We have industrial parks down there that are not occupied because there's not enough power. So those countries want more power, and they don't have a lot of money. They're not rich. So world electricity demand is going to skyrocket. This is an interesting graph I like, and that is in the horizontal direction is the number of people in a block, a region. And in the vertical direction is the number of per capita, is the kilowatt hours consumed. This is not generation, this is consumption of electricity. So in the US, on the average, every citizen uses about 1,500 watts of power continuously. Okay, not just in their home, but in their business, the police department, the sewer department, all that energy consumption of electricity is about 1,500 watts in the US. Some countries are a lot higher. Okay, Canada, Sweden, so on. They're colder. The EU is about half of us, maybe, and so on. China, up to about 400 watts per capita, continuously and growing. Okay, and so on. And here are the other developing regions of the Earth and their power consumption. You're going to hear a lot about Indonesia from me. And we're down here around South Asia, around under 100 watts per person. So they have a real need to help their economies and to help their persons. Now, we see sometimes ads in the paper about this poor black child in a straw hut reading by a a battery with a solar panel on the roof and so on. Trying to make it possible for people to enjoy some of the benefits of electricity, but they can't have the benefits like washing machines and so on until they have enough money to buy these things. That means you have to have a robust economy. You have to manufacture goods or provide services. And that means the whole infrastructure needs energy. Okay? So that's going to drive demand for electricity. So the area in each of these blocks is the population times the per capita power. So that tells you, on average, China uses 540 gigawatts of electricity. Okay, that's about the same as the US. And these others, if everyone did it what the US did, we'd fill up that whole block. There's a lot of opportunity there.
They use that many gigawatts per what time period?
The gigawatt is a rate of flow of power. So it's a gigawatt hour per hour, kind of. All right, okay?
Shouldn't that be billion people?
Yeah, well, 7.2 billion, 702,000 million.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right. Yep. Okay, so now, they want that power, and they're going to get it. These are plans from a website run by Greenpeace and its friends that talk about the existing coal plant development plans. What's in pre-construction, construction, all development, things that have been put aside and operating. And you can see that there's 574 gigawatts of new coal-fired power plants that are on the drawing boards or under construction. Why coal? Because it's cheap. And the technology is well understood. Okay? And they want it. And it's dispatchable. That is, we can turn on more power when people need it by putting more coal in the plant. Okay, so that's the reason that the developing world wants coal power. It's cheap. They need the energy. Okay. But as CO2 emissions rise, CO2 in the atmosphere goes up. I stole these graphs from the UN commission that deals with this issue. And the sort of business as usual pathway we're on is that big black line. We've got 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere already. This graph it's tricky. It should go all the way down to 0, but it didn't. So CO2 emissions under almost all scenarios are going to rise. As they rise, the climate scientists, who are much maligned, right, in the papers, try to compute what's going to happen to the average global temperature. And so, the lowest emissions pathway would create a rise of, about that number there, 1 degree centigrade, maybe. So that's the not unknown, but that's the one that has the greatest uncertainty. Exactly how does the climate work? But we know that the forcing of CO2 is absolutely up. We've known that for almost 2 centuries. That was the idea was invented first by Fourier, unbelievably, that long ago. So temperatures are going to rise, and likely they're going to rise at the high rate. But we have the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement purports to solve this issue. Okay, here is something from the UN IPCC called the GAP report, and I copied their graph right out of the report. Here again, here 20 is the bottom here, 20, 30, 40. These are gigatons of CO2 added every year to the atmosphere. The 2015 numbers are probably about right. And these are their projections under these various 4 scenarios that I mentioned before. And again, by 2030, we'll be adding 65 gigatons per year if we do nothing. There was an agreement maybe 5, 10 years ago, in Cancun, it said we're going to reduce them, so we'll only get to 59. The Paris agreements, the pledges that people made, which were voluntary, they just said, what would you like to contribute? And people made pledges, and that will reduce that down to 56 gigatons a year of CO2 added to the atmosphere, more than we're doing now. That's if we comply with it. Nobody's complying with it. Everyone picks on Trump, who withdrew from it, but no one else is complying with it either. So there we are. What's going to happen? Go ahead.
Are those net additions? Or
Those are annual additions. From burning fossil fuels, land clearing. Oh, you're right, and net of any subtractions from growing more forests and that sort of thing. Yeah. Yep. Each of those 574 new coal power plants that the developing world wants to build will emit 8 megatons of CO2 a year. Okay? 574 plants. That's 5, just multiply, it's 5 gigatons a year likely from the plants they already intend to build. Okay? We're only going to reduce it 3 and we're going to add 5. Okay?
We're in big trouble.
All right. So, hence, the business strategy for Thorcon, our company, is energy cheaper than coal. If we can make it cheaper, then the developing nations will buy it because they're cash constrained and they want the power. That's the simple business strategy. Why? Well, here's just a 2-scale picture of a recent coal power plant built, 640 megawatts versus the Thorcon plant. Now, Thorcons and coal plants are very similar in that their output is high-pressure hot steam. And that steam turns a turbine, which runs a generator and so on. It's a technology that has been refined over 100 years. So it's pretty well engineered. It's competitively priced. Okay, they don't show those here in this diagram. Okay, we're showing the part that generates the steam. Now, coal plants are more expensive because they have less energy-dense fuel. A coal plant handles 10,000 tons of coal every day. Okay? Our design has the fuel, which is uranium and thorium, dissolved in a salt, and we have to put in 280 tons of that salt every 8 years. So that's the basic reason, A, that the capital costs are low because we don't have to handle all that stuff and all the ash and whatnot that comes with it. And because the fuel is so much less, it's cheaper. In fact, here's the numbers approximately. Per gigawatt, we're looking at, well, millions. We're looking at about $1,200 per $1.2 billion per gigawatt of power from a Thorcon power plant, and about 2,000 there, millions of dollars for a similar sized coal plant. So we can undersell the coal power plant in capital cost. We can similarly have cheaper fuel because mining a little bit of expensive uranium is a lot cheaper than a lot of cheap coal. And the electricity net cost is about 3 cents versus 5 cents on newly constructed Thorcons or coal power plants. So we believe that that is a good sales point for the developing world. That's our business. Indonesia has coal plants and they're building a lot more of them. Indonesia is the 4th most populous nation on Earth, and it's kind of near the Philippines and Vietnam and all those places. Public acceptance is not bad. Okay, so we have a chance of getting Indonesia to lead the way in building these kinds of power plants. In fact, we have an office there. We have 3 people there. We have a good relationship that's ongoing with the government. The government is developing a roadmap for nuclear power for the country. The president's just been reelected. There's a new report going to him at the end of July. We expect him to like it. We'll see. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the power plant works and how we build it. Just a quick look at it for a second. The nuclear reactor parts are in here, and we'll look at those in a minute. Over here are the parts of the power plant that convert the hot molten salt thermal energy to steam. And here, the biggest and most expensive part of the plant is that steam turbine generator I mentioned before. Okay. The electrical switchgear and all that's at this end. And on the left is what we call a passive cooling pond. It's a scheme that we use that means that we can be certain the fuel is always cooled under almost any conceivable tragedy, including a loss of power. Okay. So we'll get into that. We didn't invent this. It was invented at Oak Ridge National Laboratories. They had a project that ran about 4 or 5 years. It was a small reactor, maybe 8 megawatts, something of that nature. But a lot's happened since then. And so we were able to take those designs and revise them, scale them to a power plant that could be put in a hull and floated to the site. In their design, they used, and we still use, graphite. These graphite rods, like that, have channels in them, and the molten salt, which is at a high temperature, maybe 500–600 degrees centigrade, flows upward through them. The graphite, for those in the know, moderates the nuclear power plant reactions, causing the reactions to take place. And the hot stuff comes out at the top. It's maybe 700 degrees and is used. We'll show you that in a minute. So here they're building it. Here's a picture of it. Ours will be bigger. Those graphite rods are in that yellow can, what we call pot. It's stainless steel. The advantage of this particular design that Oak Ridge invented is safety is intrinsic. Because it runs at a hot temperature and because it's liquid, the heat is very rapidly distributed through the liquid fuel. There are no hot spots like in a fuel rod. It's simple. So it can tolerate high temperature. As the temperature goes up, there's a physical principle called Doppler effect that says the reactivity drops. And so it's intrinsically stable. That's very nice. It's also been designed so that any kind of break or leak or whatever puts all that salt back into these drain tanks at the bottom, which don't have any graphite near them, and it's impossible physically for that to react. So we can always stop the reaction either by letting it overheat, or if we want to drain it, that'll stop it, or if there's a tragedy and it breaks, that'll happen as well. Around that whole can is this annulus that is 2 cylinders with water between them that is used to cool that can radiatively. That is, there's no contact between the can and that blue wall, but radiative heat transfer is used to take any excess heat from the drain tank in a problem area and let it flow into this water-filled jacket, if you will, that doesn't quite touch it. And that causes some steam to flow, which causes natural circulation into that cooling pond, which is above. Okay? The other nice thing about this design is that it's always at low pressure, same pressure as your garden hose. So if there's a break in there, it's not going to spray all over. It doesn't have gas backing it up. It's not like having 160 atmospheres of steam ready to burst through the reactor in a so-called pressurized reactor. So we're better off that way. Again, invention of Oak Ridge. Here's a little bigger picture. Here's that can with a pot in it, the reactor vessel, the cooling jacket around it. It doesn't quite touch it, and the water that circulates up to that cooling pod. So that's how that works.
So the circulation is by convection?
Correct. The circulation is by convection. So that's why we say we don't need electric power to keep it cooled. There's a whole heat transfer system that converts the hot molten salt to cooler molten salt to what's called solar salt, which is also molten, and eventually makes high pressure steam, which is used to drive the turbine. We do this for a couple of reasons. One is to keep the high pressure steam many levels away, with many barriers between it and the radioactive materials. So that if we have tragedies of some sort, we can be pretty well assured that we're not going to be spraying radioactive material all over. Again, the steam spins the turbine. This is the big low pressure turbine. The high pressure ones are really small in here. The generator's out here somewhere. Okay. And eventually, that spins the generator to make electricity. I turned the ship around here, out this end. Okay, so that's how it works. Now, from time to time, we have to change the cans. The folks at Oak Ridge were able to operate their plant for 4 years, and rather than trying to certify our plant to last for 60 or 80 years, which would take 60 or 80 years, we decided we would use the example we have of 4-year life. And we use a standard steel. We use a standard stainless steel 316 Ti steel throughout the plant. We know it has the right characteristics. But we pull it out and change it every 4 years. In reality, we use it for 4 years and we let it cool in place for another 4 years, so it's 8 years later. So we get 4 years of useful life out of it, but it doesn't come out of the bucket until 8 years. Now, people say, well, wait a minute, it's going to take forever to build these nuclear power plants. Well, that's us. Why do we do that? You know, there's no reason for that. No, we have gone to the various vendors from time to time. We still do it. We say, can you build this? And they say, no, but we could do this. And so we keep modifying the design to meet vendors' needs. And one of the shipyards says, we can build this for this much money. And it was an acceptable number. And we can do it in 9 months. Now that presumes we have pre-scheduled all the interior parts to be assembled together in the shipyard. Okay, and the biggest and most expensive lead time part is the steam turbine generator. But it's available from multiple competing vendors, so in price is going to be good. And we know if they're thinking about building these things for coal power plants, which is the same unit. We can use it in our plant. So that critical thing is possible to deal with. Just for example here, Camp Century, this company in Upper New York State bid on it, American Locomotive Company. They designed it, they built it, they transported it to Greenland, took it to the site on sled dogs, built it under the ice, and built the power plant there in 2 years. Okay, the whole thing. They had never built one before. It's not that hard. The very first one ever built took 4 years to get going, and then 2 years to get it really fitted out into the submarine, put the submarine underway. All right, that was by Rickover, thank you. All right, so it's possible to build these things quickly. our legacy is the two Devaney brothers, who are experienced in designing ships. Jack put together a whole toolkit that he uses for designing, and Jack put together a toolkit, and he basically spent several years raising money and so on, and getting shipyards to build on it. And we're using exactly that same technique for building the power plant that we use for a ship. If you think about a ship, it's got boilers and valves and pipes and heat exchangers and all the same things you have in a nuclear power plant, except for the reactor vessel itself. That's a separate kind of thing. But, so it's possible. So these guys have done it and are applying that technology to basically allow us to roll these things off an assembly line. And these shipyards, mostly in South Korea, are very competitive with each other. There's a lot of oil being shipped around the world. Getting there faster and cheaper is important. They have a lot of automated machinery that does the welding and puts these things together. A single shipyard could build 20 of these 1 gigawatt units in a year. Just one big, competent shipyard. We have enough excess capacity in the shipbuilding industry to do 100. That's where we are. But we need money. Here is a rough idea of the requirements we're in. We're still in phase 1. We've almost completed the design. The next stage of our project is what we call pre-fission construction. I'm going to jump ahead just for a second to take a look at this one plant and go back. That's the pre-fission test plant, and it's basically not radioactive. We're going to test everything out when it's easy to do. And then that'll take a couple of years to do that build and test. Then it's going to take another basically year to build the power plant, another couple of years of actually testing the power plant to be sure that it lives up to all the claims we make about safety. Okay. So eventually, we want to go into production and produce multiples of these per year. Indonesia wants 3 more. So we've got that, I say deal, but we have that discussion going on. Yeah. So again, the next step, raise $85 million to build a pre-fission test plant. That's what's happening every day now, raising the money. If you want more information, there's an elaborate website at thorconpower.com where you can explore and learn a little bit more detail about what we're doing. Anyone want another pen? Ask a question.
This isn't a question really, it's just sort of what you said, PPA loans. Most people won't know that.
Oh, PPA.
Power purchase agreement backed loans.
Right, right. Right. In order to get financing from the investors, it's nice to have a deal with the power company that says, we will pay you 6 cents a kilowatt hour for every what you generate. Once we have that in hand, it makes raising the money easier.
My question has to do with the nuclear waste.
Okay.
It's not like 3 Mile in Chernobyl, Fukushima, where it blasts out and goes into the ground and leaches into the ocean, but what happens to the thorium and the uranium byproducts?
In our case, we're going to just store them for a while until the political environment changes enough that we can process that and reuse the thorium and uranium. We're going to have to set aside some of the radioactive fission products in a safe place for hundreds of years. Yep. Yep. But for now, we're not going to let that hold up our project. Hello. Free pen.
My question is concerning the metal containers that you said would go for 4 years, then you store them for 4 years. are those radioactive, so can they be recycled in any way, or they become radioactive waste?
The stainless steel will be mildly radioactive because it's got cobalt in it, and it will absorb some neutrons. But again, that's the reason we leave it around 4 years, so that when we swing it out from the crane to drop it into the ship, we don't have a lot of hazardous radiation that makes problems for the crew. So what we would like to be able to do is to reuse those, and we won't know how strong they are, what states they're in, until we've gotten farther along.
You seem to be playing down a bit the nuclear waste part of this story.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask it again like that gentleman did there, maybe just a little different way. So we hear often that the nuclear waste is a major reason not to go in the nuclear power direction.
Right.
Whether that's right or wrong and what politicians are pushing that, that's a big question. We don't know, but you talked about storing it in a safe place. So what is a safe place, and how big of a problem is this nuclear waste issue for the world?
Okay, you're previewing the next talk, but I do have one slide on that somewhere. That is, here's the Yankee Row, U.S. being shut down. Basically what they did there is to put the fuel rods in these big concrete canisters in Row, Massachusetts. And that's where they are today. They just sit there. That's what's happened to every nuclear power plant. They just sit there. The NRC says, well, they'll be safe for 100 years or so. No problem. We could, if we wanted, take those fuel rods out, repackage them, because there'll be 100 years from now, it'll be a lot less radioactive. But you could hug one of those concrete casts for months before you had a dose that would have any effect. No one's ever been injured by radioactive waste from power plants. So it's a big emotional problem, more than anything else. Okay. Go ahead.
I presume you've made your pitch to AIP and the World Bank and other international lenders. What reaction have you got?
Well, the reaction you get at the World Bank is, oh, no, we don't do nuclear. Well, why don't you do nuclear? Well, because our policy says we don't do nuclear. Why does your policy say that? Well, we just don't do it. That's the reaction from the World Bank. That's the reaction from the Chinese, what's the new one? I got a proposal into them, then they had a board meeting, and then they said, no, we don't do nuclear. So all these organizations, these banks, these development banks, we think of them being banks, but they're really political organizations, like countries, okay? They're driven by the politics of who's in charge and who gains and so on. So it's very hard to raise money, but we're slowly doing it. Go ahead.
Yes. I don't know very much about this, but it's interesting to me. And I keep hearing that the French reworked their
all the things we care about.
Or whatever it is, and it doesn't. I mean, they can use this stuff again.
France has a process for taking spent nuclear fuel and reusing the uranium and some of the plutonium in new fuel rods. They get about 17% of their fuel from reprocessing old fuel. So it helps a little. It doesn't solve the problem totally. They still have radioactive waste that they have to have somewhere. Now, I don't know if it's important to you, but there are two kinds of radioactive waste. When you split the atoms, you get fission products, which are things like strontium and cesium and iodine and so on. Okay, and that's one. And those are typically highly radioactive because they're short-lived, a few years. You also get what we call actinized, the plutonium, the californium, the americium, all these other things. And they have much longer lifetimes. But they're potentially very useful because you get more energy out of them. No, there's no way anyone's going to reuse the fission products. That's got to be set aside somewhere. Okay.
Now, what about all the developments with fusion power research?
I would say to you, why would you want fusion? Why would you want fusion?
You're not getting the fission byproducts, are you?
Well, that's what people say. But of course, the whole power plant itself is neutron irradiated. It's going to have some. There might be a breakthrough someday. You know, Tri-Alpha keeps telling us that, and it might happen. But even if it does, it'll be 40 years before we can.
What about the long-term business plan if all of a sudden fusion has a breakthrough like they're claiming China's doing?
We can get our money back in 30, 40 years, no problem. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the salt reactors shutting down by processes of overheating or the salt going down into a...
Both, either way.
Does that happen unattended? Like if everybody had to abandon ship, would that happen all on its own?
Yes, it would. We have designed the plant to be what we call, I won't use the word, well, operator proof. We always have in the back of our mind the fact that the operator is actually an underground Al-Qaeda agent who is going to try to do anything he can to sacrifice his own life and yet cause a bigger radioactive release to frighten and maybe hurt people. And we have designed the plant in such a way that we believe that's not possible. Because we make that design test every time we make a change to the design. Okay. Go ahead.
What would keep a leak from leaching into the ocean?
Well, there's 3 barriers, at minimum 3 barriers between the pot with the liquid salt in it and the can and so on. So that's one. Now,
are there international standards for the disposal and use of radioactive waste? And is it enforced or is it by jurisdiction?
I think it's all by jurisdiction.
So one country or group of countries could do it differently than another?
Yeah, I mean, there are some treaties, like people say, well, we all agreed we would never bury radioactive waste in the bottom of the ocean. And I don't know why they said that, but we all agreed to that. So in a sense, that's an international jurisdiction. Go ahead.
My understanding is that the French have done very well with their used stuff by storing it above ground. If you were to work on a way to store this leftover stuff in advance, would that make people more happy about?
Sure. Again, it's a political problem. In the last year, the company called Deep Isolation has proposed the following technology, and that is you drill basically an oil well, a dry hole, if you will, and after a mile or so down, you'd go sideways underground, and you're way beneath any biologically active or aquifers and so on. And they've demonstrated loading dummy fuel cartridges from light water power plants into that way underground. They use oil drilling technology, very inexpensive. You can do it anywhere. You can do it right outside your plant. You have a big derrick, build that hole in the ground. Then they demonstrated retrieving it. The company's called Deep Isolation. And it's a technology that has been known, and it would work if people would allow it, but people are so fearful that they all storm the State House and say, make it and outlaw it, you know. So.
Why is it your problem about the nuclear waste? Why isn't it the Indonesians' problem?
Well, because.
It's a political problem. If the Indonesians say, we'll accept it, you don't get, I mean, that's their problem, right?
Well, it's a sensitive area, and we have to negotiate that kind of carefully.
Okay, but you don't have to negotiate it with the U.S. government.
No, because we can't do it in the U.S.
Yes,
We went.
there you go.
We
All these questions are really only
Understand it, none of this is done in the U.S. People don't realize how difficult it is. We went to propose building a prototype in Hanford, okay? And we went to the NRC, we went to the Department of Energy 4 or 5 years ago, and they basically said, no, you can't do that. At the same time, the GAO, the Government Accountability, Office, yeah, they changed the name, I've forgotten what it is. Anyway, they did an audit of NRC, and they said it would take at least a decade and probably over $1 billion in fees and engineering fees and lawyer fees and consulting fees to get to the point where the NRC would say yes or no, you can do that. Okay? So, I mean, basically, you can't imagine going to a bunch of investors and saying, would you bet $1 billion on this? Of course not. The other thing to keep in mind is that there have been no nuclear power plants designed and built in the U.S. since the NRC was founded. The one you heard about in Watts Bar 1, that was started in 1972, before the NRC. Okay? And they grandfathered them in, so that's the only addition in recent history. So it's totally impossible.
I just want to say we've had spent $1 billion on building a depository for nuclear waste in Nevada, but that has been stonewalled by Harry Reid for 20 years when he was Speaker of the House, basically. We have a facility already, we can't use it.
That is true. Now, the casinos were afraid that people would shy away from spending their money in Las Vegas if they had to be anywhere near that. So the casinos influenced Harry Reid to influence Obama to make Jaxo be the NRC chairman to forbid it. That's how that all worked.
The ship looks to be an awfully expensive part of the total cost of the unit, and rather than being a vehicle for transportation to getting it somewhere, why spend all that money on the ship? Isn't there an easier way to transport it without building what must be a multi-billion-dollar vehicle?
Yes, and our founding chairman would love you for saying that. But because, yes, we have, the earliest design we had was basically building the large blocks, 50 or ton subassemblies in the shipyard, bringing them to the site, putting them in place and welding them. We still have those designs available. And it would save a lot of money on steel that we need to put into this ship, basically, to be able to float it. Now, nevertheless, the advantage is you don't have to have any skilled labor at the site where you're going to put the plant in. You're in a developing nation with no particular resources. You have people who want baksheesh. Okay, we can avoid all those kind of problems if we build a whole power plant at a skilled site that's used to doing it. So if we're successful and we need to get the price down a little more, we can dispense with the ship and bring those parts somewhere and do it less expensively. But it's good enough, okay? I mean, perfect is the enemy of the good, right?
How long till a ship rusts out like a super tanker?
Well, super tankers don't rust out. Then we have corrosion control. We have, what do you call it, express, you put a potential between the ship and anodes in the water, and you run a current through it. So it won't rust out if it's maintained properly.
I didn't understand very well the slide about the timing. Like,
Yep.
You had some period of time for construction and some period of time for testing and some period of time. And what is the earliest possible time you would actually have one of these built up and ready?
Right. Let me see if I can find the right slide.
Or 100 of them, or however many you're planning to build.
Yeah, let me find the right slide. Come on, Bob. Hang on. Oh, that doesn't work.
Sorry.
Here we go. That one.
Yeah. There we go. It took me all that time to formulate that.
All right. It's okay. I understand. Well, if we can get funding now, let's call that year 2000, okay? And
why don't we call it 2020?
well, like I said, I won't be around then.
Oh. But if we get funding now, it's like 20.
Oh, 20, I'm sorry, I guess that's wrong. 2000, you're right. To call this the year 2020. I got it backwards, sorry. So there's 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. So we might be able to go in production in 26. But we'll have a plant up and running by then. Now,
Go into production in 2026.
yes, multiple,
And then there's a certain amount of time that it takes to build it,
2 years
2 years. So 2028,
to build multiples.
to build multiples and spread them around.
Correct.
And
I mean, it's
by
got to be a,
2030, in terms of carbon emissions,
well, we can't do much for, a lot for 2030, but we can do a lot for 2050.
okay.
How much of that cost is to be paid by the customer up front?
As much as we could do, but no, Indonesia wants us to fund the thing, and they want to buy the power. So all of the money, the only commitment we have for money from Indonesia, it would be the power purchase agreement from their,
So they wouldn't pay the $1 billion up front?
No, I mean, each one of these plants in production generates over $1 billion a year in profit. Okay, so we expect to be able to attract investors who are willing to take the risk of dealing with the unpredictable political situation and so on. But it could be very profitable to own shares in the company. So that's where we expect to get the funding for the prototype. Again, once we get to production, then we can go to the banks. We say, hey, we got a power plant, it works, we want to build another one. The bank will say, well, we'll loan you the money, but you got to put in 10% of your own money. Something like that. In the back.
It's my understanding that there's maybe 4 or 5 other 4th generation reactor projects being explored now in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And they all use somewhat different technologies of one sort or another. What is it about the Thorcon project that gives you confidence that one of these other developing programs won't supersede it and be more cost effective and therefore more successful?
Well, we can't be, we don't know what's happening inside all those other companies. But we do know that the goals of our business are cheaper than coal. Okay, and that's a guiding principle, to get costs down. We have other people like the firm in Cambridge. They were trying to have a nuclear power plant that used waste, okay, burns waste to make power. They had their eye on the wrong ball. Okay, what we want is cheap as possible so we can sell as many. Okay, and they eventually failed. Okay, so what we have is skilled engineering talent that has built ships this way. We have the idea of cheaper than coal. We have the rule that says no new technology, only technologies that have been demonstrated. We don't have R&D. So that gives us the self-confidence anyhow.
It seems like the main hurdle for the expansion of nuclear power in the world and for society, humanity to benefit from it in a maximum way is this perception or misperception about the nuclear waste issue. So why are companies that produce nuclear power plants or governments that want nuclear power not getting together and organizing, going to the UN, setting an international agreement, standards that overcomes these misperceptions? And that's one. And the other question is, you're emphasizing very much cheap. I would prefer to pay more for the right solution. So we're talking about the welfare of humanity.
Yeah, we're not compromising any safety issues. We would swear to you that our design is safer than anybody else's, but we won't know that until we get to the end of the stress tests. But you're...
Going back to the first part of the question, why are companies like yourselves and countries who are dependent and want to grow nuclear power not getting together and overcoming these misperceptions and having an international agreement with the UN or within the UN or wherever?
Well, I mean, in the U.S., the government took over the responsibility for spent fuel. Okay, the companies are not allowed to do anything with it. The government owns it. Okay, so, and some of the more conservative organizations have said, you know, why don't you make the companies handle it, and so on. They don't. But again, I'd like to get on to the next topic, because that's going to help answer your question. Go ahead.
Well, I think the word perception is really important. As the world looks at this problem, nobody seems to propose any solution to it. How can you convince people? Or how are you working to convince everyone, all of us, that nuclear power is safe, cost-effective, and efficient?
Right. Well, one is the waste issue. That's one perception. Another perception is, oh, we're going to have more Fukushimas, or we're going to have radioactive fish, right? And another perception is, oh, they're going to blow up, or the guy's going to make a bomb out of it. Okay, so we got to handle all those perceptions.
All over.
Yeah.
What are you doing to alleviate them? What are you doing to solve those perceptions?
Okay. Some of us are members of an outfit called Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information. It may or may not work. Our idea is that if we can somehow educate the public about the health effects of radiation, then we might get somewhere. So let me try and talk about that just for a minute. Okay. All right. All right. If you ask a question about this talk, then you get one of these brochures.
What are the bigger prizes?
You know, let me pay attention here first. Let's go here. I mentioned this before. Here's a reference. If you want to get a new reactor certified, it takes a lot of time. But all the media print scary stories. Here's the New York Times. Quote, a 2009 study, CT scans in the hospital, which use x-rays, will cause 14,000 excess deaths from 1 year of CT scans. This is out of the New York Times. Okay? So, which you think wouldn't be a scaremongering newspaper. Okay?
Excess deaths means that if they hadn't had the CT scans, there would be that many fewer deaths? Is that what you
That's what it says.
You really mean sooner death. It's not that they never die.
No,
yeah.
That's the way they write it.
Right. So there's the background for why when people say, oh, what about the waste? It's radioactive. Okay. The background for this is that we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And people were afraid, with Russia building the bomb as well, that we were going to have all-out nuclear war around the world. And so the Nobel Committee wanted to somehow tamp down that effort. And they wanted to increase the fear of radiation, not just from the bombs, but from everything associated with it. And so they decided to award this prize to Herman Miller, who had learned how to use X-rays to create mutations in fruit flies. And in his Nobel acceptance speech, he said, there is no threshold dose for radiation. Any radiation is harmful. Okay? So the end effect of that was that word spread out, and people were frightened. They were afraid of the testing in the atmosphere, and so on. And so it kind of damped down a little bit of the Cold War effort to have more and more bombs. Okay? So it had a positive effect, but it wasn't correct. It was not a peer-reviewed paper. It was, he knew, in fact, that what he was saying was wrong because people have found letters that he had read and so on. But nevertheless, the Nobel Committee got their thing. So we got to do a little physics here, or medicine, just for a minute. Radiation dose, how much radiation you get. A common mammography dose is 2 milligrays. What is that? A milligray is basically a watt-second of energy absorbed by a kilogram of tissue. Okay, a watt second. Doesn't seem like very much, right? A watt's not very much money. 2/1000th of it. But it causes ionization in the tissue, which can cause effects. Now you're going to see a lot of, if you read in this area, you're going to see rads and sieverts and gray and so on. For this talk, we're going to just say sieverts are the same as gray, and that's true certainly for X-rays. But there is natural background radiation, just to give you an idea how much there is. Remember we said 2 millisieverts for a mammography. These kind of sources create radiation. In the US, the average is about 3 millisieverts per kilogram of person per year. Denver 4, Finland 7, and you can see the map. It depends where you live. Okay? So we have adapted to that. These are pretty low levels, and there's nothing to be afraid of. But I mean, the EPA says, you cannot expose the public to more than 1. And the EPA says, oh, in the case of Yucca Mountain, you cannot expose any people who are illiterate to more than 0.1 millisieverts of radiation for the next 10,000 years. That's the law. Okay? And the engineers say, well, we did that.
I know this might be outside the purview of what you're talking about, but why are we looking at northern Spain that has a greater than 10 dose of radiation?
Probably there could be uranium underground. Uranium decays and makes radium, which makes radon, and that's probably where it comes. So that's one way you can explore for uranium. But again, we did blow up 2 big cities, and the blast itself killed a lot of people in the normal way. Buildings collapsed, fire, and so on. Some died from radiation. A lot survived. Maybe 100,000 people survived. And the US and Japan put together a task force to basically survey the health effects on those almost 100,000 people continually, every frequent examinations, and so on. And they published this data. Now, I got a hold of the data, loaded it down in my spreadsheet, and so on, came up with this chart. The question is, how much cancer is caused by radiation? And we have pretty good estimates as to how much radiation people have absorbed by things like looking at their teeth, by where they were, all that kind of stuff. And we find that we can use this as a control. The people, here's the cancer rate for people who nominally lived in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but weren't there at the time of the explosion. Okay, and here's their cancer rate. Looks like 21% or so. That's our null set. The people who got up to 5 millisieverts didn't see any more or less cancers. Same, up to 100 millisieverts, no change in the cancer rate. Cancers begin to show up for people who are more highly irradiated. Again, this was an irradiation all at once, not over a year. It was a big pulse. So altogether, for the 16,000 people in the study, there were about 800 excess cancers for the people who were exposed by the bomb blasts. So my point of this slide is that there's no effect at all under 100 millisieverts, really. Okay? But people are afraid of it. And partly is because the Radiation Effects Research Foundation is another outfit that wants to prevent nuclear war, and they want to continue the concept that Miller proposed that any radiation is dangerous. So they publish stuff like this. Okay, here's a chart. Only problem with this chart is this is 1,000 millisieverts. This is 2,000, right? They don't tell you what's going on at the low dose. They just don't publish that. So they're trying to say it's dangerous. We do the extrapolation. death rates are proportional to dose. But what's the real answer? Here's a guy who was the chairman of the UN Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, and he worked on the Chernobyl problem as well. And he says that what's surprising is if you actually count the number of cancer deaths, there were fewer by the emergency workers at the plant. Now you could say, oh, well, that's the healthy worker effect, you know, that we only hired people who were in good health. Okay, so that's a legitimate complaint. But even so, it's very hard to wonder if these numbers are really accurate. But there's clearly no groundswell of increased cancer risk, even though Helen Caldicott and her ilk said there are 1 million deaths resulting from the Chernobyl accident, and Greenpeace increased that to 4 million. Okay? The evidence isn't there. The evidence is this. Okay? Fukushima, the UN went there, and they said, well, the dosages aren't very high. Even if you assumed that the dose rate was the death rate or the cancer rate was proportional to dose, it's so low, nothing bad is going to happen. So it was harmless. We didn't have to evacuate people. You could shelter in place in an accident like that.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
I don't think so.
Why? Why don't you think so?
The fish in the Pacific Ocean are picking up excess radiation from the leaking radioactivity. It's getting to the west coast of the U.S.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the dosage yet, but it's too soon to even make a conclusion.
The fish are being, cesium-137 was put into the environment by that plant. Some got into the ocean, fish eat it, okay, and sure enough, if you have a really sensitive instrument and you take the fish apart, you can get.
But it's going to leak underground for 1,000 years probably.
Well, I don't, go ahead. Go ahead.
Good for all this with our colleagues in the great debate in Vermont.
Yes.
The question to ask is, how radioactive were the fish before Fukushima? And the answer isn't zero. You know, they might be a little bit more than they are naturally from all the radioactivity washing down into the ocean over millions of years from the granite mountains.
Yeah.
You know, that's the real science.
It's too soon to even draw a conclusion.
No, it isn't.
No.
Because of the amount of
Look up
dose.
at Woods Hole stuff. Woods Hole's done a lot of research on that. It's not too soon for.
All right. So let's hold that thought and come back to it.
I'll research.
Because people are going to leave. Let's get through the slides. Come back to that. Yes, quickly.
I'd like to go back to the nuclear waste issue because I think it's more problematic than is easily understood. It was my understanding that the radioactive waste, the spent fuel of the Thorium reactor, is qualitatively different than that from the Generation 1 reactors that are now operating, both in terms of the amount of waste and in the lifetime, call it the half-life of the waste products themselves. Could you comment on that a little bit?
It may be somewhat different. I don't think it's qualitatively different. They all have similar waste materials profiles. On the other hand, if we had half as much, would that matter? We had a tenth as much. There was after Fukushima, there was a meeting over in Norwich where the people were basically talking about the radiation levels. And they were off by a factor of 1 million, and no one noticed. The point is, any is enough of an argument for the people who were frightened. Okay, so how do you keep that from happening?
Yeah, can I ask one question about it?
Sure.
You're talking about after Chernobyl the incidence of solid tumors. Solid tumors isn't the issue.
What, leukemia?
It's sort of like it's non-essential information. It's great. But the significance is the leukemia, the red cell stem lines, the platelet lines. That's where the effect is. It's not your solid tumors. Why are you showing that?
Just to keep it short, that's all.
It's meaningless.
It's not meaningless. There are two effects. Leukemia, as you said, shows up in 3 to 5 years after the exposure. and there have been a lot of analyses done of leukemia incidences at Fukushima, at Nagasaki.
I'm talking about Chernobyl in your slide there. I don't know about the other.
I don't know about leukemia at Chernobyl.
Well, what about the Japanese volunteers who went to Fukushima afterward were all over 60 because they didn't want their young people to go and submit to all that danger, and all those people have developed cancer.
Well, you have to show me the paper that says they all developed cancer. I don't understand that.
I will look for it.
Yeah. All right. Just getting through here for a minute. People worry about DNA breaks from ionizing radiation. Just for a second here, you get one DNA break per cell per second on average in your body. Okay? This happens, but it's a double helix, so it's easily repaired. There's a redundant piece of information on the other side. There are double strand breaks that also occur that conceivably could cause a problem if we have these recombined in improper orders. But again, the most frequent cause is metabolism from eating, right? Oxygen. So things like hydrogen peroxide are byproducts of the metabolic process in the cell. And those ions cause those kind of breaks. It takes a lot of radiation to come in and approach the level of ionization damage caused by just plain oxygen. We also know it's repaired. We know the repair rates are on the order of an hour for repairing DNA breaks. We know that the Nobel Prize was given to 3 biologists a few years ago who kind of uncovered the way this repair work works. We've all heard about the poor radium dial painters and so on, and we concentrate on the terrible cancers, bone cancers, that they had. Well, eventually they found out why, and they found out they had to cut down the exposure rates. But clearly, from this kind of analyses, dose rates up to even 10 sieverts in the bone didn't cause tumors. So it took a considerable dose.
So those people in Spain are safe?
Hmm?
Those people in Spain.
What Spain?
Where all the radiation is in the
yeah. Anything under 100 millisieverts, no problem. We just look at X-ray therapies. I say X-ray. If you want to eradicate a tumor, you try to rotate the patient or the beam to focus it on the area of the tumor you want to overheat and overexpose and overionize. And the total dose over the treatment period can be as much as 80,000 millisieverts. That's common. Okay? And the tissues next to it don't get quite that much, but they get hit pretty badly. And the way this works is if we give a couple of days between treatments, the biological recovery processes work for the normal healthy cells, but they don't work for cancer cells because cancer cells are so busy trying to grow all the time. They're not interested in repairs. But if LNT were true, this kind of fractionated radiation therapy wouldn't work because it would cause more cancers. And it does. It causes maybe 1 or 2% more cancers. LNT, linear no threshold. That was the idea that the health effect was directly proportional to the dose, even at low levels. Breast cancer mortality, again, we used to treat TB with X-rays. This comes from Canada. But again, you have to have high radiation doses in order to begin to create a problem. Nuclear shipyard workers. The US government had people working to repair nuclear-powered submarines. And in the steel is cobalt. And neutrons create cobalt-60 sometimes. which is radioactive. So they were worried that they were going to get sued in the future by workers at the plant. So they did an elaborate controlled experiment to monitor all the workers to find out how much radiation they got and so on. And they had two groups. One group was exposed to about 8 millisieverts more than background. But they had a lower death rate, which surprised everybody. And when people say, what about the healthy worker effect? Well, no, these were all the same class of worker. They were age matched and job matched. So we got rid of two potential confounders in that experiment. That's the most scientifically controlled experiment done on irradiating people. In Taiwan, we had a problem where an abandoned medical isotope radiation device was scrapped and melted into a batch of steel, and which was used to make girders, which went into these apartment buildings. And the people who resided there over their lives, on average, got 48 millisieverts more. So if you believe that, you apply the rules for LNT and so on that our government enforces, you'd predict 150 cancers, but only 55 were shown, 55 fewer. If you do the math and you remember statistics, that's very improbable. You have you're expecting 150 and you only see 95. The chances of that are 1 in 10,000.
I believe that, having looked at this, it's 150 more than the normal amount of cancers from everything else. And what they actually got was 55 fewer than the normal amount from everything else. That's the.
I think that's right.
That's the vaccination effect.
Yeah.
Radiation at certain levels.
So that's another piece of information that's hardly ever reported. Now, I'm a member of a group that tries to promote knowledge about these kinds of papers. And this guy, Wade Allison, has now 2 books out, both of which are good. We have petitioned the NRC to abandon the LNT rule and just set a limit. They have limits. The limits are today about 50 millisieverts per year for any radiation worker and about 1 extra millisievert per year for the general public. And that's okay, we could all live with that. But they also have another rule that says as low as reasonably achievable. So it says, doesn't matter what we said, but you have to take every precaution you can think of to lower radiation doses. And one of the effects of that is to raise the price of nuclear power plants out of sight. So we want to get rid of that rule. It's been 4 years now. Well, 3 years. 2015? Yeah, 4 years. And they have not ruled on it. So we're trying. But the answer is radiation is really safe. When you talk about that poor fish that has the cesium-137 in it, that's because our instrumentation can measure and find 1 atom decaying. Okay? A single atom will set it off. And what? There's 10 to the 23rd atoms per gram of tissue. That's pretty sensitive. Our bodies ourselves, just from what we've eaten, have about a radiation of about 5,000 becquerels, or 5,000 decays per second in our bodies, mostly from potassium-40, but also carbon-14 and that sort of thing. So radiation is unjustly really feared at the low level.
Well, there's a second component that bothers me more than the radiation. It's the heavy metals. You know, we have problems with arsenic and lead and other heavy metals. So
yeah.
The heavy metals from, say, thorium running downhill in a leak through the pond will eventually leach into things. So it'd be like having your children consume arsenic or lead or any other heavy metals. So the radiation might not get you, but the heavy metal might have you.
Yeah, heavy metals are all poisonous to some degree, toxic. Well, I'll give you an example. We mine about 60,000 tons of arsenic every year in the world. And we also mine about 60,000 tons of uranium in the world, of which maybe 1% of it becomes nuclear waste that's radioactive. We're worried about 600 tons. Now, We know where all those 600 tons are. They're in those casks, those concrete casks and so on. We keep track of them. No one keeps track of the 60,000 tons of arsenic that would go into every darn product in the world. Where's that?
What about the coal?
Coal, yeah. Yeah. The,
Well, I'm not saying nuclear is a problem. It's all a problem.
yeah. But we also have a problem. We also have a problem where there's a whole industry of radiation protection that has lived its life on making us fearful. And a lot of what we've been reading in the science journals isn't necessarily right either. Okay? So I want to just show you this one cartoon, which I think is great. And that is the jelly bean cartoon. Okay, you can see it. I won't read it. Okay, so he says, oh, then somebody says, well, what about a small subset of the data?
Read it, please. Can you read it?
Read it? You can't see it. I'm sorry. Jelly beans cause acne. Scientists investigate. Oh, but we're playing Minecraft. We found no link between jelly beans and acne, p greater than 0.05. Well, that's a little technical about statistics. That means that if we did this thing 20 different times, we have to do it 20 times before we might even find a link. That settles that. And this other person says, well, maybe a certain color causes it. Okay?
What is Minecraft?
It's a computer game kids play, and now grown up.
Grown-up kids.
It's a $1 billion industry. Microsoft bought them.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
It's major.
So we found no link between purple jelly beans and acne, brown jelly beans, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally somebody says, oh, we got a link here. Well, they did 20 different experiments. And sure enough, one of them showed there was a link, because that's what p greater than, that's just statistics. And so what happens is headlines, right? We have the same problem with nuclear, okay? We get the problem. You probably saw headlines where Japan paid a Fukushima power plant worker, I don't know, thousands of dollars because he had cancer, okay? And, well, people do get cancer, but, we look for the things that make headlines and put them in the newspapers. All right, so never mind, the explanation is not very good. All right, let's go on with the questions.
On the cost chart, if you went to the original plan of not having a ship but actually build it in site, you said it's less costly than building a super tanker to hold the power plant.
Right.
How much of the cost is for the ship versus the actual plant? Because I guess I'd feel
I don't know, we might be able to reduce the cost 20% or something.
I'd feel safer if it was up on dry land away from the ocean if it leaked.
It's on dry land in the sense, well, it's on wet land, actually. It's anchored to the bottom.
Right, but if it leaked, it would run
Yeah.
into the ocean.
Yeah. But from a marketing point of view, it's kind of nice. We can drive it up and sell power. Go ahead.
My name is Dick Holbrook, and in December of 1964, I was in Barcelona, Spain, and a large white ship pulled in, and people were going aboard it. And my buddy John and I said, what are they doing? It was the SS nuclear ship Savannah. It was about 500 feet. And I talked to the skipper there, and I said, how about the insurance? Who's insuring this? And he didn't know. I talked to my cousin in Concord, New Hampshire. He was an actuarial. And he says, we do not approve of that, the insurance industry. I went to Putney, Vermont on business, and they told me the same thing. You can buy a policy, but the government backs it up. There are no private insurance companies that will insure anything nuclear, even in the hospitals.
Every nuclear power plant is insured by an insurance company in the United States for, I don't know the number, $200–300 million. They did buy insurance. If that insurance is not enough, the rules in the US say every other nuclear power plant must chip in equally to cover any excess costs beyond that first policy's limit, up to an amount on the order of $100 million each plant. And there are now like 98 plants or so in the US. So there is insurance. It's commercially available, and it's backed up by the liabilities of all the other nuclear power plants in the US. Radiation facts. There we go. I printed these up last night. Oh, I'm sorry. Here, take another. All right. Any questions? Go ahead.
I have another one. I was in the Coast Guard the whole year of 1952 in Kwajalein at the Ebi. And during that year, some of the nuclear tests, they did 66 tests between 1946 and 1958. And we talked to McKinney. And I was there with some of the bombs. This is a book called Day of Two Suns, and it tells how the health of the Marshallese people are. And I've been in touch with these people since the 1952. And it was in the high area, of course, when the radiation, the women that were pregnant, their babies are born with no brains and no bones, because the strontium-90 isotope goes vertically to the calcium, and this isn't the correct word, but it dissolves the calcium. So I would suggest going to the Marshall Islands and see if those people aren't a little emotional about what we did to them.
Right.
Have you been over to the Marshall
I have
Islands?
not, but
Have you talked to any Marshallese people?
I have not.
No, I have. They've come here and I've talked to them.
Yeah, but I'm surprised if we don't have some medical journals describing what you just told us.
But they've been censored. My cousin, Robert Cervink, for the Brookhaven Laboratory, did a film there, and he showed me the film.
Yeah.
They will not talk.
Okay. Well, it's got to do with bombs and defense. Yeah, that's a heck of a lot different than a nuclear power plant.
I don't think so.
Go ahead. Oh yeah, sure. Excuse me.
Thank you.
Okay. Here, I'll leave a few extra here.
As long as we're sharing life experiences, I'd like to say that I had the privilege of visiting the French reprocessing facilities and standing right there while they were making plutonium the pellets that go into a fuel rod and so forth. And I just thought if people wanted, I can't explain everything about the process, but I saw the whole thing. I was at each of the places, the place where they store the fuel, the place where they dissolve the fuel, the place where they make the pellets and so forth. So I just wanted, if anyone wanted to talk about it, I'm happy to do that.
Good.
And really, I have a friend, I used to work in ceramics, okay? So they have this stuff in a glove box. Well, I mean, I've been in a lot of labs that have glove boxes that weren't nuclear, and I have a friend who's she's a chemist, and she got a contract for doing some work with nuclear. I said, but you're not set up for nuclear. She said, I'm set up for beryllium. It's harder. So.
Yeah.
You got to the point where you want to talk about the fear factor?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to talk about with radiation. Yeah.
But let me just say this. My father was on the board of directors of New England Power. At the time, we were trying to get, they were subsidiaries trying to get the Seabrook Station up and going. So he probably brainwashed me. But I remember having to go down with people in the legislature and the protesters in Seabrook was just out of this world. Nobody thought that 18 miles away we were retrofitting nuclear submarines. Now, I mean, a submarine could blow up as easily as a nuclear plant, couldn't it?
Well, I don't think either of them could blow up.
Well, I mean, but the point is,
but yeah, you could have a leak or something broke, yeah.
But there was weren't even conscious of the military.
Yeah, it was a political activist effort, yeah. Yeah,
They're still there.
Yes, Seabrook is still there.
No, the business.
Yeah, yeah.
They're a new bit.
It's a hard message to get across, particularly when you got outfits like the New York Times publishing scare stories.
Well, 3 or 4 summers ago, at the summer lecture series, one of the distinguished speakers was talking about, and he was talking about fusion versus fission, and I don't know if I understood it, but it's far safer than any of the alternatives in terms of the environmental.
It has been, yes. Yeah, I didn't get that point across. Okay, we can talk forever, or we can talk